All right, welcome to Lesson 10. Another sequencing game you'll see in the upper right. This is drawn from the December 2010 LSAT PrepTest 62. And we'll do this one, and then lessons 11 and 12, also sequencing games. The next one, lesson 11, is significantly harder than this one. And then lesson 12, most people would find a very hard game. Let's jump into this one. As I've mentioned before, if you don't have access to the December 2010 LSAT, just go ahead and look at our website, and you'll see a link to the book you'll need to purchase. A couple points about this game. First, the logic games section of the LSAT has, as you hopefully know by now, 4 games in 35 minutes to complete them. 35 divided by 4, 8 minutes and 45 seconds. So about 9 minutes on average. And you'll see the goal for this game, 9 minutes. And of course, averages are averages. Some games you can do more quickly, some will take more time. Usually a sequencing game takes fewer than 9 minutes. Usually. Here, this is the first game on the test, and usually the first game is a sequencing game and usually a lot easier than the other games. Here we say 9 minutes, so this one a little harder than your typical sequencing game. Now, one of the pros here is that they do give you 6 questions. So if you understand the rules and you diagram the game very well, one benefit is that you will have an opportunity to get 6 points on this game if you get them all right rather than 5. So that's a nice thing. But as I said, a sequencing game that's a little harder than your average sequencing game. And overall, as I said earlier, among all logic games, a game of medium difficulty. A second point, eventually we'll take a look at question 6. This is the first rule replacement question that we will have covered in the 10 lessons so far. The infamous rule replacement question. Every LSAT now includes one rule replacement question. So one game we'll have a rule replacement question. We'll talk about how to think about those kind of questions. And it's the last one you want to do. And when tackling it, it is especially helpful to have great diagrams. Will make it a lot easier to attack that kind of a question. So let's get started here. Our items, GLP, STW. GLP, STW. We're going to arrange those. And if you read the rules, it'll become very obvious very quickly that this is just a simple sequencing. And when I say simple, I don't mean it's an easy game. I just mean that it's 6 items, 6 slots. Each item goes in 1 slot. So traditional sequencing game. And in this game, as I believe I mentioned in an earlier lesson, we're going to create not 2, but actually 3 broad scenarios, 3 states of the world, so to speak. And you'll see in a moment why. Let's take a look at the rules. First rule, W before L. Simple enough. W before L. And so I'm going to write next to the letters up top, a little dot by W, a little dot by L. I want to know at the end if there are any floaters, any letters that aren't restricted by a rule. So W before L, simple enough. How about 2? P must come before both G and S. So P before G and S. And so we've now talked about G, we've now talked about S. I'm going to put, and P, I'm going to put dots by all of those. Rule 3, the letters assigned to slots 2 and 3 cannot be G or S or T. So things that can't be true, I like to write on the top of the diagram. So G can't go in 2 or 3, nor S, nor T. So that's a lot. We've seen games in the past in which we write, 1, maybe 2 letters that can't go in a certain slot. But 3 is a lot. And so one question we will definitely ask ourselves is, well, if those letters can't go in slots 2 and 3, who can go in slots 2 and 3? And I'm just going to write the rule in the diagram. No need to write it on the left-hand side here. How about rule 4? T cannot go in 6. All right, so what do we do next? As always, crucial step, we're going to combine the rules as best we can. Rule 1, W before L. Well, there's no other rule that talks about W or L, but we do want to take a look at where W and L can go and where they can't go. So I'm looking at spaces 2 and 3. Can't have T, S, or G. Looks like each of them could have W or L or P. Not ready to write anything down yet, but we want to be aware of that. How about rule 2? Well, we want to combine rule 2 and rule 3 somehow. They both talk about G and S. And what can we say? Well, we can't really combine them so much as, well, in a way we can. G and S, where can they go? Where can't they go? Obviously, we know can't go in 2 or 3. They also can't go in slot 1. And you know this by now, and we normally don't take the time to write it out there because it becomes a little obvious after you've done a number of games. But in this case, let's do that because it's going to help us identify where G and S can go. And where can they go? They can only go in 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 6. And we also want to be aware, it looks like G and S are essentially interchangeable. They both have to follow P, but in no particular order. In between slots 4, 5, and 6, there's no other rule that applies to G and S. So they're essentially interchangeable. So I want to note that. What else do we know about rule 2? Well, so P goes before G and S. So let's think about it. P can't go in 6. And again, I don't usually take the time to write that out. It's usually pretty obvious. But since we have so many rules on who can't go where, you get the feeling it might be a good idea to continue to note those limitations as we draw the diagram. So P can't go in 6. It also can't go in 5 because it has to precede both G and S. P, it could go in 4 or 3 or 2 or 1. So again, some things we want to write out, some things we don't, but definitely things we do want to have a sense of. And then how about the last rule? T cannot go in slot 6. All right. Well, here's where I get into the idea of creating not 2, but 3 broad scenarios. What deduction can we make from that rule? Well, we can make a deduction that since T can't go in 6, and we said earlier it can't go in 2 or 3 either, T can go in slot 1 or 4 or 5. Well, if I just wrote that out as went on to write T in 1 or 4 or 5, I mean, that's a lot to have to think about every time we look at this diagram. We could do it, and if you just stuck with what we've written so far, you definitely could still tackle this game. But here is, I think, a better idea. Why don't we create another scenario? And here again with slots 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 6. And in this scenario, and this will be scenario 2, the first scenario 1. Well, in the first scenario, why don't we put T in slot 1? And by the way, now I'm going to get rid of this. I wrote T in 1, 4, or 5. We're going to simplify things now. Put T in slot 1. In scenario 2, we're going to put T in slot 4. And then if we create a third scenario, and I'll put it underneath because it's very similar to this second scenario, we're going to put T in slot 5. And why do I say it's very similar? Well, looking at scenario 1, we said that G and S have to occupy 4 and or 5 and or 6. So right here in scenario 2, 5 is going to be G or S, 6 is going to be G or S. Down here in what we'll now label as scenario 3, similar story. G or S are going to be in slot 4 and slot 6. And so what about the first 3 slots? In scenario 2 up here, we look at the rules. It's going to be W before L, and P is essentially a floater now between slots 1 and 3. So why don't we put a circle around it? And same story right below. W before L, somewhere in slots 1, 2, and 3, and then P again, a little bit of a floater. So if we get a question that clearly puts us into world 2 or world 3, we're going to be able to find the answer very quickly now. Now let's go back and take a look at world 1. So the GS, now we said earlier that P has to come at some point before GS. We said that P could be in slot 4, 3, or now 2. Of course, not slot 1 anymore. And then W and L. W and L, where can they go? Well, W could not be in 4, 5, or 6 because then there would be no room for L. W's got to be in slot 2 or 3. Write that as a floater down here in slots 4, 5, and 6. Now, as you can see, this first scenario looks a lot more complicated than scenarios 2 and 3. Imagine how much more complicated it would look if we didn't create the 3 scenarios. Still pretty complicated, although we can at least, we should be able to figure out what's going on in scenario 1. I think we have a pretty good sense of who can go where. All right, question 1, acceptable situation question. Rule 1, W before L. So what can we get rid of? A is fine, B is fine, but C is gone. C is gone. All right, why don't you pause for a moment, take a look at rule 2, and note that that is 2 rules. P has to come before G and S. Then rules 3 and 4, you see that both of those are written above, written on the top of the diagram, and then we'll come back and see what the correct answer is. Rule 2 gets rid of A. Rule 3 gets rid of E. Rule 4 gets rid of B. Answer D. Next question, question 2. We'll go to a new slide here. Question 2. On the 4th day, neither G nor S nor T. That being the case, which of the following must be true? We've got a must be true question. And let's take a look here. We don't even have to write anything down. Just look at world 2 and world 3. If day 4 cannot have T or G or S, then scenarios 2 and 3 are out. And we are only looking at scenario 1. Look at scenario 1, apply the same rules. On 4, day 4, you can't have G, S, or T. So who can you have on day 4? Only L. So that's a potential answer. What's another potential answer? An even easier one. T has to be on day 1. Take a quick look at the answer choices. Answer D, T on day 1. Next slide, we're going to skip over question 3 because it's a general question. How about question 4? Now, in this question, dealing with days 4, 5, and 6, before you look at the choices, look at the diagrams and ask, what do we know now about days 4, 5, and 6? What do we know now? And with that in mind, then take a look at the choices. You should be looking for something. So go ahead and take a moment on that. What days 4, 5, and 6 have in common in all three scenarios is that they have to include both G and S. So any answer choice that does not include both G and S is gone, which means what? A is gone, B is gone, C is gone, D is gone. It's got to be E. And just to verify that E cannot be true, take a look at W, G, and L. Well, what about W? In scenario 1, it has to be in spots 2 or 3. In scenarios 2 and 3, W can only appear in 1 or 2 or 3, but cannot appear in 4, 5, or 6. Answer E to this question. Let's take a look at question 5. Question 5, day 6 is not G or S, so which of the following must be true? Well, we've automatically ruled out scenarios 2 and 3, so we're in scenario 1. If day 6 is not G or S, who can it be? The only possibility is L. It can't be P. P could be on day 4, but it has to come before both G and S. P could not be on day 6. Obviously, T and W can't either. It's got to be L, so let's look for that answer choice. We know it's got to be L. Answer B. Now, question 6, the rule replacement question. That is always the hardest question on the game. In fact, it's probably the hardest question on the test. So we will definitely save that for last. Let's go back and do question 2 now. Did I say question 2? Meant to say question 3. Which of the following must be true? And now that we've gone through a number of questions, we have a good sense of what must be true and what can't be true and what can be true. And the incorrect answer choices are going to be what? Things that either can't be true or could be true but aren't a must be true, aren't necessarily true. And of course, the must be true in what? All three scenarios. Looking at scenarios 2 and 3, I don't see anything that must be true in both scenarios combined. What we're going to have to do here is just take a look at the choices one by one, nothing to really jump to right away. So why don't you pause for a moment, take a look, and then we'll come back. Okay, so with the help of the diagrams we've written, although we do have to go through all 5 choices, and that takes a little time, clearly E, the right answer. So now we will end with question 6, the rule replacement question. Rule replacement, what's this all about? The question will mention one of the rules that currently exists, and then it will say if we substituted that rule, if we got rid of it, but created another rule instead and applied that rule, what rule could we create that would have exactly the same effect as the original rule? Now, same effect, what does that mean? Well, when you start the game, the rules, what do? They allow for certain arrangements of the letters, and they also prevent certain arrangements of the letters. When in question 6, we take out one of the rules and then have to create a new rule to replace it, that new rule has to also allow all of the arrangements that were allowed before and prohibit all the arrangements that were prohibited before. Has to have the exact same effect as the initial rule. No more arrangements are allowed, no fewer arrangements are allowed. And when you look at the answer choices, you'll often see choices that do have a similar impact on the possible arrangements that the initial rule had, but one that is not exactly the same. It may permit more possible arrangements. An answer choice may also prevent certain arrangements that are now possible. So we want a choice that does neither, has exactly the same impact on the game as the initial rule. Another point, oftentimes when you do logic games questions, in fact, most of the time, when you see an answer that stands out as the right answer, you circle and move on to save time. In a rule replacement question, on the other hand, what you're likely to find are a number of answer choices that seem like pretty good candidates. A number of choices that seem like they could be right. A number of choices you look at and think, this is a close call. With that in mind, very important to read all 5 answer choices on a rule replacement question. If you read one answer choice and you think to yourself, that's it, that's got to be it, makes perfect sense. It is highly likely that if you read more answer choices, you'll say the same thing to yourself when you read another answer choice and maybe a third answer choice. So you want to go through all 5 of them before you make a final decision. Now I'm going to encourage you to look at these 5 choices very carefully, ponder them over for a little while. Don't try to do this question quickly. And here's one hint I'll give you for this and all other rule replacement questions. Look at the rule. In this case, it's a cannot rule. T cannot be in slot 6. And then ask yourself, how can I restate that rule as not a cannot, but as a must be rule? If the rule is that T cannot be in slot 6, how would you state a corresponding rule that such and such must be somewhere? That's the first hint. The second hint is you probably will not be so fortunate as to see that what you just came up with is the correct answer choice. What may very well happen, however, is that the correct answer choice will be easier to spot, easier to identify once you've done what we just said, taken the first rule, then translated it into a corresponding rule, that such and such must be true. So I know that's a lot to ponder, but take a look at the choices, all 5 choices. Think about it for a while, and then we'll come back and take a look at this. Okay, here's the idea. Saying that T cannot be in slot 6 is the same as saying in this game that T must be in slots 1 or 4 or 5, and only 1 or 4 or 5. Exactly the same thing. So that's a restatement of the initial rule. Saying T can't be in slot 6 is exactly the same thing as saying T must be in 1 or 4 or 5. And now with that in mind, if you haven't selected an answer choice already, or you're not certain about the choice you selected, now take another look. Now that we've restated the rule, see if one of the answer choices does make sense now, does stand out to you now. What's the answer? If T must be in 1 or 4 or 5, that is the same as saying answer A. T must be scheduled for a day earlier than G or S or both. You can see that in all 3 scenarios, that is true, and that replacing the rule with answer choice A doesn't allow for any more possible arrangements, any additional possible arrangements, and doesn't prevent any arrangements that are now permissible. And I'll let you ponder over the 4 remaining choices, and I think some will now stand out to you as clearly false. One point I'll make, answer D. Answer D, if T is not in slot 1, it must appear immediately before G. Not correct, because in our current scenarios, T could appear immediately before S. But if answer choice D said instead that if T isn't in spot 1, it must be scheduled immediately before either G or S, well, then it could be the correct answer. Don't want to spend too much time here talking about the reasons why B, C, D, and E are wrong, but in the comments section, we'll write a little bit about why choices B, C, D, and E are incorrect. So in a moment, we'll take a look at the top 5 list. In the meantime, if this lesson helped you understand the logic game better, it would be fantastic if you can click the like button below, share it with your friends, any friends who may be preparing for the LSAT now. And if you have any comments, it would be great if you post them. It's really amazing how people who are preparing for the test can benefit from comments that are made by other people, can gain some real insights from comments made by other people. So I hope you can help out others in the, what do we want to call it, the LSAT community, or the LSAT preparation community. And on that subject, sort of on that subject, I made a point in the first video. One of the goals here is to get you very comfortable with logic games very quickly in, let's say, the first 2 weeks that you're studying for the LSAT, so that you can then spend the rest of your time focusing on the real meat of the test, the logical reasoning sections. Those are 2 of the 4 sections on the test. And that's not to say you're going to get perfect scores on logic games from now on, but you want to be very, very familiar with them early on so that you don't find yourself in the group of people, which quite honestly is probably the majority of test takers, who 2 weeks before the test, they say, logical reasoning, I get, reading comp, I get, but I still just do not know what's going on with the logic games. We want to prevent you from getting into that second group. Okay, so top 5 list. I said in an earlier lesson that, just to use ballpark numbers here, the amount of weight that an admissions committee is going to place on all the different parts of your application, your LSAT score, your GPA, and everything else, varies from school to school. But as a ballpark estimate, it's going to be approximately 60% LSAT or more, 40% GPA or less, and everything else, recommendations, resume, personal statement, between 2 and 5%. That's a very general statement, and it's a general statement in 2 ways. One, every school has literally a formula, a mathematical formula, in which they plug in your LSAT score, plug in your GPA, and calculate a number that's going to give them a sense of whether you're going to do well in law school or not. The admissions process is surprisingly data-driven. You wouldn't think, but law school admissions are actually very data-driven. And I say a number that will give them a sense of whether you're likely to do well in law school. Well, how would they know? Because they have the same number for every previous student at the school. They compile data over the years on the GPAs and LSAT of every student, then look later on how well they did. And every school has discovered 2 things. Number 1, your LSAT is not a great predictor of how well you'll do, but number 2, it happens to be an even better predictor than your GPA. And why is that? Well, lots of theories about that. But the unfortunate fact is that the decision on whether to grant you admissions or not is almost entirely determined by your LSAT score and your GPA. But I say almost. The other 2 to 5%, again, just a ballpark estimate, it's going to change from school to school. All of those things will have some influence if you're a close call. And law schools put applications in essentially 3 buckets. If your LSAT score and your GPA are both, let's say, a point or 2 higher than the average, you are considered what they call a presumptive admit or a presumptive yes. If your LSAT and your GPA are a point or two below the average, you'd be considered a presumptive deny or a presumptive no. And what does all that mean? Well, if you're a presumptive admit, that means that one person will look at your profile and make sure there are no red flags. If you're a presumptive deny, one person will look at your profile and take a look to see if letters of recommendation or your personal statement or your resume, if anything just jumps out as above and beyond the charts, fantastic, says, hey, instead of saying no, we should bring this application for the full committee to take a look. And then there's everybody else in the middle whose LSAT scores and GPA are almost exactly equal to the averages. And the size of that group may be, let's say, 10% of the total number of applicants. Well, if you're in that group, all of a sudden your personal statement, resume, letters of recommendation become extremely important, just as they are for people in the presumptive deny group, although of course they're even more important for folks in that group. So if you're in that middle 10%, let's say, you want to break a tie. You want a personal statement and a resume and a letter of recommendation that breaks the tie. And with that in mind, here we are, top 5 things to keep in mind about letters of recommendation. And if you take a look at the comments section, you'll see that we've posted not only this list, but also a link to a U.S. News article that says some helpful things about this subject. So here are the 5 things to keep in mind about letters of recommendation. The first, and the point I just made, they can be a significant tiebreaker. Second, and another very important point, suppose you were thinking about 2 professors from whom you might seek a letter of recommendation. And the 2 people are, the first is, let's say, the chairman of the history department, whose lecture class you took, and you did very well in the class. Let's say you got an A, but you don't know the professor very well. Maybe you've talked to him once, and you think to yourself, well, he doesn't know much about me, but I did really well in his class, and he's the chairman of the department. If I get a recommendation from him, the admissions committee must be impressed with that. And then you also think to yourself, well, professor number 2, she just got out of graduate school, just got her PhD. This is her first year on the faculty, but I'm taking a seminar with her. It's a class with me and only 10 other people. I took her class in the fall semester of my junior year. I took it in the spring semester of my junior year. I spoke up in class a lot. I went to her office hours every 2 weeks. Whenever I submitted a paper for the class, I did well on it. I got a good grade. And I would also talk to her about my papers during office hours. I asked her lots of smart questions. We get along very well. Should I go with the professor who's the chairman of the department? Or should I go with the much junior professor who knows me very well and knows my work very well? The correct answer to that question, it's not even a close call. You seek a letter of recommendation from the professor who knows you the best, who's worked with you closely, who can give you, I'm going to underline here, not only words of praise, but stories, anecdotes, examples. Talk about things you said in class. Talk about things you said in the paper. Talk about how impressive you are. Letters that just make general statements about how good a student you were. Admissions officers read those all the time and they're bored to tears. But the letter that talks about you and your talents and your goals in detail, that is 100 times more effective. So keep that in mind. And most people who are watching this video are either college juniors or rising seniors or folks who recently began their fall semester and plan to apply this year and are facing admissions deadlines that are probably in January. If you'd like to request a letter of recommendation from a professor whose class you are taking right now, this would be an excellent time to start participating in class a little bit more, and even better to start going to office hours. Point number 3, and a related point. Of course, you want your recommender to convey to the committee that you have a lot of academic potential. But beyond that, you also want them to help you make your case for why you want to go to law school and why you'd be good in law school. Well, with that in mind, it would be a very good idea to sit down with the professor and let them understand why you want to go to law school. The person can make a better case for you if they know why you want to go to law school. Point number 4, when you ask someone to write a letter of recommendation for you, you're really asking them for a favor. Well, you really owe it to that person to make it as easy as possible for them to grant you that favor. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, you want to make it easier for the person to write the letter by, for example, giving them examples of your past work, tests, papers. Second, you want to give them plenty of time. You don't want to ask them at the last minute. Third, as I just mentioned, you want to help them understand why you want to go to law school. And if you're going to ask them to write a letter for you, you want to ask them to do it when they have the time to do it. So for example, not during finals, not while they're grading papers, not while they're grading exams, not while they're on their summer vacation. So be very mindful of all of that. The best time to ask would be after you've taken the person's class, you've received your grades. If you're a junior and you've just finished the professor's class, whether it's fall semester or spring semester, wait until you get your grades, and assuming you did well in the class, ask for the recommendation a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later when the new semester has just started and the professor has some time. Again, ask them after you've received your grades and see when it would be a convenient time for them to write the letter, whether it's in the few weeks following the semester or whether it's later in the summer after they come back from vacation or whatever it may be. But you want them to write the letter while your performance is still fresh in their mind. And no matter when you're seeking the recommendation, give the person a specific deadline. Tell them exactly when you need it to be completed so that they can put it on their calendar. And if it hasn't been completed, let's say a week before you need it, just send the person a reminder. So that's the story about letters of recommendation. They can actually be very influential if you're not in the presumptive admit category. And again, there's a link in the comments section worth taking a look at. Next lesson, lesson 11, we're going to do another sequencing game, one that's even harder than this one. Look forward to seeing you there. And actually, if you have any comments about letters of recommendation, be sure to post those in the comments section. We'd love to read them. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.